So a lot of my work, matter of fact, pretty much all of my work has been looking at the big picture in terms of what's going on in the planet, climate change, environmental change. I come at this from the background of paleontology, so I guess I'm used to thinking at big time scales and big geographic scales. And as Janne mentioned, one of the things I've done a lot of in the past is try to calibrate how far into today's extinction crisis we actually are, how that compares with some major extinction events in the Earth's past, and most importantly, what can we do to avoid the sixth mass extinction? So I think it's probably no surprise to anyone in this room that we are really killing species at a remarkably fast rate. As mentioned in the introductory talk, we have wiped out 50% of the world's wildlife in the last 40 years, and that doesn't mean we've wiped out 50% of the species. It means we've taken the numbers of individuals in many species and cut that number in half. If we look at the International Union for the Conservation of Nature's analyses of species that have been well studied, we find that there's something like well over 25,000 species at this point that are known to be threatened with extinction, and that spans pretty much all plant and animal groups. So that's what's been happening, and the reason we call it the sixth mass extinction is because if we go back 600 million years and just track what extinction rates looked like through that time when multicellular life was abundant on Earth, what we find are there's 5 past peaks in extinction rates that are well above the background level. And those are what we call the big 5 mass extinctions. You can see the peaks on the screen here. And these are times when 75% or more of the known species go extinct. So that's what we mean by a mass extinction, and that's what people are thinking about now with the so-called sixth mass extinction. And the question is, how far have we come, and is there anything we can do about it? So the bad news is we've come pretty far. If you just look at the numbers of species, the percentages of species that we know to be at risk of extinction, and in the various groups, you can see the little black icons there. This is what I call my extinction ohmometer. If you go from 0% on the left to 100% extinction of species on the right, and that vertical black line is the 75% mass extinction benchmark, with the yellow icons in the lower right showing you where the big 5 mass extinctions fall. And what you can see is that for most plant and animal groups, we have somewhere between 15 to 65% of species that are known to be at risk. So we're moving pretty fast towards that 75% benchmark. That's the bad news. The good news, actually, though, is if we look at how many species we've caused to disappear off the face of the Earth, that's the white icons. And really not very many, less than 1% in most of those groups. So what that means is that we're on this terribly fast extinction trend, but we still have almost everything that we want to save out there to be saved. We still have most of the species that we've been riding the planet with for the past 11,000 years still there to be saved. So that's encouraging, and it's also encouraging that we have some major success stories, this being one of many examples, the Galapagos tortoises. Originally, if you turn the clock back about 600 years, there were about 250,000 of these things on the Galapagos Islands. Then we started sending out whaling ships that used the tortoises for food because they would live a long time. They could just stack them up in the hold of the ships and have fresh meat for months and months. That plus later on invasive species eating the turtle eggs and so on reduced their numbers to about 2,000 individuals. At about that time, the Ecuadorian government stepped in, said, no, we really want to save these things. Many programs were put in place, which included things like collecting the turtle eggs, bringing them back to incubators, raising the baby turtles until they were big enough to withstand the invasive predators, and then returning them to the beaches. As a result, populations are now coming back up, and they're about 10,000. So the problem, though, is these sorts of species-by-species approaches are very time-consuming, very expensive, and as I said, we're talking about upwards of 30,000 species. So if we're really going to make a dent in this extinction crisis, we have to address the root causes so that we end up saving lots of species by the same action. And again, there's no surprise what these root causes are. Ultimately, it comes down to how many human bodies are on Earth. And we've been growing our populations fast. That results in lots of habitat loss. So that's the big problem, taking over places that other species need to live and using them for our own means. We also tend to overexploit certain species, various fish, large mammals like elephants and rhinos because of their illegal economic benefits. And then thrown on top of that, we have some very dramatic energy needs. Having all those human bodies on Earth means that we actually have 10 times too many big animals on Earth today with respect to what it can support. So we have to produce energy. The way we produce energy is causing climate change, and you put it all together, and that's the extinction crisis. Okay. So let's just kind of step through these things very quickly, and then we'll talk about the role of ecological compensation in fixing it. So population growth. Here's the world that we live in, and the important thing to note is look at the year 2050, where that gray arrow is, and then these different lines are showing you different population growth models that go from the year 1950. All right, now you can look at that gray arrow pointing at the year 2050. And the point here is that there are several different projections depending on whether fertility rates come down to replacement value, that is about two kids per family, in areas of the world where they are already not at that. But what I want you to notice is it doesn't matter which of those projections you use. The year 2050, we're going to have between 9 and 11 billion people on the planet. So a couple billion people more at least than we have now. So as we think about going forward and preventing extinctions and preserving ecosystems, that's a reality that we have to deal with. The other part of that reality is that because we have so many big bodies on the planet now, we actually have to add a lot of energy to the system. So if you think about before people got into the act, where does the energy come from to run ecosystems? Well, it came from the sun, plants through photosynthesis, converting heat energy to chemical energy, animals eating the plants, and cycles through. And basically there's a fixed amount that can be produced because of that photosynthesis filter that comes out to, the numbers are 728 exajoules per year. Don't worry about what an exajoule is, but 728 is the number. However, just people take 30% of that net primary productivity away from everything else. That's not nearly enough for us. On a yearly basis, the human race requires about 760 exajoules. So basically, in order to make things work, we have to add 550 exajoules of energy each year, and we get that from fossil fuels. We have to keep producing energy some way, or a lot of people die. I mean, that's just the bottom line. Okay, so the way we've been producing it is, of course, fossil fuels. That's heating up the planet at a dramatic pace, much faster than species on Earth are accustomed to seeing. Now, you often hear, if you talk to people who don't feel climate change is much of a problem, well, sure, climate has always been changing in Earth's past. What's the big deal? Well, the big deal is shown on this graph here, which and you've actually got 4 different panels there. The left one shows you the sort of the annual, or not that, the fluctuation in temperature from about 5 million years ago to 1 million years ago, and the dotted line at the 0 there is sort of the global average for this whole time. Then the next panel jumps the scale to 500,000 years ago to 10,000 years ago. You see more variation at that scale. The next panel over takes you up to about 1,000 years ago to the present. That's the one labeled Holocene. And then we start going into the future. So what you can see is that, yes, climate has always fluctuated, but where we're going now is to a whole new place, a place that species on the planet have not seen. As a matter of fact, the last time the planet had the mean global temperature that's indicated by the orange, which is the trajectory we're on, was about 14 million years ago. Plus, we're moving to that over just 100 or so years, whereas any similar magnitude of change in the past has taken literally thousands to millions of years to achieve. So that both the pace and where we're going is to a new place. And that's a problem for species. Here's what tropical forests in many parts of the world would end up looking like with a 4 to 6 degrees C temperature rise. And yes, there are still plants there, but it's a totally different ecosystem. And there's not really a way for tropical species to exist in those sorts of ecosystems. Same thing in the oceans, very real possibility that by the year 2070, most coral reefs on Earth would look like the picture on the right. So these are serious things. Basically, if you try to quantify how much does climate change increase extinction risk, it about doubles the amount of species that are threatened with extinction, which is really all that these 2 graphs are showing. That's the take-home message here. Okay, so we've got climate change going on, a whole new thing. This is taking place on this landscape where we've already altered, actually 51% of the planet is the latest estimates. The purple area have been converted for agriculture, cities, roads, and so on. So 50% of the planet is kind of out of play as far as natural ecosystems that species are accustomed to. They really have no place to move in the sense of climate change. It's, as I mentioned, it's agriculture, deforestation that is most of that. And then finally, we've got direct exploitation of lots of species for things like illegal wildlife trade. So that's the extinction landscape. Those are the causes. Now let's talk about solutions. People really care about this stuff when they know that species are in trouble. And, you know, this is a rhino that I had the pleasure of observing in South Africa a couple of years ago, and I was there with a safari guide, and he said, well, yeah, pretty cool, but what you don't see is off there in the bushes is a guy in a camouflage uniform and an AK-47. These rhinos are guarded 24/7 with armed guards. The mandate is shoot to kill for poachers. So this is the kind of thing we're willing to do, but again, it's a case-by-case basis. And I think if we start thinking about the bigger picture, this is where ecological compensation can really help. And there's really three scales that I think we should be thinking about. One is a global scale, and that's maybe a little different sort of ecological compensation than we normally think about in terms of just trading land. It has to do with climate change, and I'll explain that in a minute. The second is at the I call them interregional alliances. It's actually international, but it's not nations cooperating. It's entities across national boundaries, different states, for example, in different countries. And then the third is where most conservation happens, at the local level. So just three quick examples here. The global issue has to do with climate change. And you know, we don't just have to minimize our use of fossil fuels, we have to completely get off of fossil fuels. And this is just to illustrate that. The red line is if we kept doing things, kept our energy production just as it is, using lots of coal. You have cumulative emissions on the vertical axis, years into the future, on the horizontal one. So on the right-hand side is where we'd be in the year 2200 in this case. And the green line is the emission scenario we need to stay under 2 degrees C. If we replaced all the coal plants in the world with the cleanest burning fossil fuel, which is natural gas, we only get to the yellow line. So that's not going to do it. We have to actually totally replace fossil fuels. And actually I say that, I won't say with a heavy heart, but the guy highlighted there with the really big ears, that's my grandfather. He was a coal miner for 40 years, underground coal miner. My first job out of college was a coal exploration geologist for Atlantic Richfield Company, back when I didn't know any better. You know, we learn. So the point being that is it even possible to do this, get off of fossil fuels? And the answer to that is probably yes. And there have been various studies. The one I like to cite is by Mark Jacobson at Stanford University and Mark DeLucchi at University of California at Davis, who've done analyses that basically show pretty much with existing technology, shown here, solar, wind, water, tides and waves, for the stationary system, electric vehicles, and algal biofuels for the transportation system. We can make this transformation by the year 2050. The technology is there. We know how many machines we have to build. We can talk later about the feasibility of that, but basically it's all, we've done similarly intense tasks before, and I can give you examples. I don't have time to go through all of them right now, but take home here is technologically we can do this. And we also have the capacity to help the developing world leapfrog past fossil fuels to get the energy production they need with renewables. And as a matter of fact, the developing world is already doing that, even without the developed world's help. This is a hospital at the base of Mount Everest, 100% renewable energy, has operating rooms, it's run by solar and microhydro. So, how do we do that? It costs money. And this is where I think about the theme of ecological compensation at this huge scale. Turns out it's the richest billion people on the planet, of whom we all belong to, that produce 60% of the greenhouse gas problem. The poorest 5%, or the poorest 3 billion, produce only 5% of the problem. So it's a rich folks' problem, which means that it's also economically viable. Now, the estimates I've run across are sort of encapsulated here. It would take about an annual input of $750 billion to $1,000 billion per year over the next 50 years to make this all work. And if you think about it, if each of us richest 1 billion could contribute $750 to $1,000 a year, you know, less than my plane ticket cost to get here, problem solved. Okay? So if you put it in that perspective, we can compensate financially for and actually stave off this severe ecological damage. Okay, let's step down to the next scale, what I call interregional alliances. And an example of this are programs such as this Governor's Climate and Forest Alliance, a group of US states and states in Mexico, Peru, Brazil, Spain, Ivory Coast, you can read the list, have gotten together and come up with financial instruments so that people can buy offsets, people in developed countries can buy carbon offsets by providing funds for people in developing countries to keep forests intact. So this is basically a carbon trading scheme, but it also has really important positive implications for saving biodiversity, because it turns out this is 32% of the tropical forests in the world, and about 50% of terrestrial species survive in tropical forests. So the more we can keep those intact, the better off we are. So this is sort of a win-win for both climate and directly for biodiversity. And the important thing to note here is that this is not nation to nation. This is independent states within nations that are making their own agreements across international boundaries. And then the third scale I'll mention as an example is really, I think, where it all happens, and that's the local scale. You know, everything we do is in our local community, and my local community these days happens to be Stanford University in Palo Alto, California. If you sort of browse the internet, these are the kinds of pictures that come up for Stanford University. And most people think of Stanford as just being the buildings. But pretty much everything you see in this picture up to the skyline is Stanford University campus. About over 8,000 acres. It's a big chunk of land. Some of it is very densely developed. Stanford shopping mall, commercial real estate, some of the big, you know, Hewlett-Packard, Facebook, those sorts of things were on Stanford lands. And then faculty and student housing. So that's 30%. The other 70% ranges from mildly developed to sort of intermediate development to fairly pristine places like Jasper Ridge Biological Preserve, whereas I spend most of my time. So in this picture, in the lower right-hand corner, you're looking at some of the intact oak woodlands at Jasper Ridge, and then you can see in the middle ground some agricultural and equestrian lands, And then in the far distance, the buildings are the Stanford University campus proper and some of the developed areas in Palo Alto. So turns out that this 8,000 acres actually has really high biodiversity. California itself is a biodiversity hotspot, and this part of California happens to be particularly diverse for a variety of reasons. We still have breeding mountain lions that sometime come down onto campus. This particular picture is on some of our camera traps at Jasper Ridge. We've got a couple of breeding, large predators. So many of those species, well, not many, but a fair number, are federally or state listed species as being at risk of extinction. And most of those tend to be concentrated in wetland habitats. All right, so knowing all this, Stanford has actually been practicing ecological compensation for a while now. An example is, I think it was in 2009, this new hotel complex called the Rosewood Inn was put in, and doing that required building over some wetlands. As a compensatory gesture, new wetlands were created, and you can see on the picture where those were and what they look like. So the trade-off was almost a one-for-one there. And in addition, the Rosewood Inn devoted a certain percentage of its profits to putting in trees along one of the boulevards in Menlo Park. So more recently, this sort of approach has been formalized into what's called the Stanford Habitat Conservation Plan that's been developed in conjunction with the federal agencies in accordance with both federal and state laws that have to do with endangered species, so that half of Stanford lands are divided up into these various zones, and some zones are considered kind of untouchable and places to construct new habitats, whereas in the more developed areas, even if there's more development in the more developed areas, something to compensate for that has to happen in the less developed areas. And basically things such as this example where the tiger salamander is one of the endangered species, so actually constructing tiger salamander reserves and increasing the habitat. And this is done in a fairly formalized way of where the offset credits are specified, so okay, if I take out this much over here, I have to put in that much over there. So these, it's working basically. I think it's a good example of ecological compensation that's working. But I'll end by pointing out two potential dangers with ecological compensation. One is that there are some ecological settings that if you destroy them, they're gone. You cannot compensate them. And in our local example, at Jasper Ridge, we have these serpentine grasslands. The soils there are derived from serpentinite rocks, which are very toxic to most species. As a result, invasive species do very poorly on them, and they've preserved a good portion of the native California flora, particularly the grasslands and wildflowers. If you go into those places with a bulldozer, you cannot replace them. They're gone forever. So I think that's one thing to keep in mind with compensation programs. The other thing to keep in mind is we're doing this not in a static world anymore. The world is changing really fast, and climate change is, but one example. So in thinking about compensatory landscapes, you have to be thinking in terms of, okay, is this a historical, relatively intact ecosystem that I'm trying to keep that way? Or is this a novel ecosystem that's already been much disturbed? And the approaches you're going to use in the two areas are going to have to be very different. If it's a historical ecosystem, you have to think about, given global change, can we even keep it in the state it is, or should we just use it as an adaptive capacity landscape? If it's a novel ecosystem, then the choice is, okay, do we want to maximize biodiversity? Do we want to mimic some sort of historical process? Do we want to maximize some ecosystem service? Those are all decisions that have to be made in advance, and in making those decisions, it's really important to think about not just how an ecosystem has been for the past 200 years, but what's the range of variation it's seen in the past thousands of years, and there are ways of getting at that information. Okay, so just to finish up here then, I think that it is possible to avoid the sixth mass extinction. I think it is going to require putting in place ecological compensation at these three scales that I've mentioned. But I'd also say that ecological compensation by itself won't be enough to solve the problem. We really do have to preserve some of these irreplaceable ecosystems with protections, and we do have to address the root causes that are driving the whole thing. But clearly, ecological compensation is going to be a part of that puzzle. Will we succeed? I don't know. Your guess is as good as mine on that. I would say that if we're going to succeed, it's not, 5 years down the road we have to start working on it. It's like right now. It's action time now. We've got this short window to turn the ship in the right direction. So that's where we're at now.
My name is Eva Primer. My father was a farmer. He's a very enthusiastic sustainability guy. He has worked in the developing world and in Finland, and he has imported the protein plant faba bean to Finland and the no-till drill sowing system. So I have different background. Maybe that's where I come from also with my thoughts, that I feel when I listen to the eco-critical ideas that we are in a way introduced to this meeting today, it's kind of unfamiliar pain to me. I'm much more pragmatic, solutions-oriented person, and I study policy. So I'm thinking that with the ideas that we have too much population, we have too much meat consumption, we have a lot of things that are luxury. I'm asking you, Anthony, how do you feel about the example that you have in Stanford, that the compensation is made for building a hotel out of all things? Isn't that a bit of a luxury thing that we might find difficult to justify?
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, I mean, hotels definitely are a luxury, but on the other hand, people want places to stay, right? So it sort of goes back to, again, the root causes. The reason we have so much development is because we have more and more people in the world. So I don't think we're going to get away from having to build things unless population growth stabilizes. I don't know. I mean, I guess I don't have a problem with building hotels. Yeah, it's a luxury item, but especially that one, it's a luxury hotel. But this is what people want. So this is the trade-off, right? And we're all responsible in that we want to live a certain lifestyle, and then, all right, if we also want to have healthy nature, healthy natural ecosystems. How do we actually make that work? And I think that's, you know, the purpose of this discussion today, the conference, is to get at those points. So, I don't know, I mean, you know, we talk about how we how we present environmental issues, and all too often the environmental issues are presented as, well, if you want to do anything about this, go live in a cave in the cold. But people don't want to do that. So I think we have to find that right balance and figure out how to do it.